In August of 1854, a traveling physician named Dr. Samuel Morton was called to an isolated plantation in rural Louisiana, about 40 miles from Baton Rouge. The plantation owner's wife, Catherine Blackwood, had collapsed and was suffering from what the enslaved workers described as a madness that wouldn't stop. When Dr. Morton arrived and began examining Mrs. Blackwood, she grabbed his arm and whispered through tears, "You have to stop him. He's making us do things. Terrible things. My daughter, the slaves. He's creating an army of... I don't even know what to call them. Children that shouldn't exist. Please, you have to stop him." Dr. Morton initially thought Catherine was suffering from hysteria or fever-induced delusion, but over the next 3 days, as he treated her and observed the plantation, he began to notice things that made his blood run cold. The unusual number of light-skinned children among the enslaved population, all around the same age. The way the plantation owner, Marcus Blackwood, monitored his wife and 17-year-old daughter Adelaide with obsessive control, the terror in the eyes of certain enslaved men whenever Marcus approached, and most disturbing of all, the detailed journals Marcus kept in his study, which Dr. Morton discovered when Marcus asked him to retrieve a medical text. What Dr. Morton found in those journals would lead to one of the most horrifying and suppressed scandals in antebellum Louisiana history. A plantation owner who had spent 5 years forcing his own wife and daughter to participate in a systematic breeding program with enslaved men he had carefully selected, all in pursuit of a twisted eugenic experiment to create what he called the perfect servant class. Before we begin, I need to give you the strongest possible content warning. This story involves forced breeding, sexual coercion of multiple victims including a minor, psychological torture, systematic abuse, and the complete corruption of a family by the absolute power of slavery. Multiple people, enslaved men, a wife, a daughter, and the children produced, were victims of one man's eugenic obsession and the system that gave him absolute authority over human bodies. This is documented history that reveals how slavery didn't just brutalize enslaved people. It corrupted and destroyed everyone it touched. If you need to stop watching, please do. If you're ready, stay with me. Marcus Blackwood was born in 1802 in South Carolina to a moderately wealthy planting family. From his youth, he was obsessed with what he called the science of human improvement, the pseudo-scientific theories of heredity, racial hierarchy, and selective breeding that were popular among educated white men in the antebellum South. He read every European and American text on racial theory, attended lectures on phrenology and human breeding, and corresponded with other wealthy men who shared his beliefs that careful control of reproduction could create superior and inferior classes of human beings. In 1835, at age 33, Marcus purchased a large but isolated plantation in Louisiana with money inherited from his father. The plantation was deliberately chosen for its isolation, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single dirt road that Marcus controlled, surrounded by dense swamp that made escape nearly impossible. He purchased 80 enslaved people to work the plantation, and he began implementing what he called his breeding protocols, forcing specific enslaved people to reproduce with partners he selected based on physical traits he considered desirable. This was not unusual for plantation owners. Forced breeding was a common and systematic practice in American slavery. What made Marcus different, what made him monstrous even by the horrific standards of slavery, was what happened next. In 1837, Marcus married Catherine Ashford, the 19-year-old daughter of a declining Virginia family that needed money more than they needed. To ask questions about the isolated plantation Marcus owned. Catherine was educated, religious, and raised with the belief that wives should submit to their husbands in all things. She had no idea what Marcus had planned for her. Their daughter, Adelaide, was born in 1838. Marcus was disappointed that his first child was not a male heir, but he saw an opportunity. He would raise Adelaide from birth to be part of his grand experiment, to see breeding programs as natural and scientific rather than horrifying, For the first 5 years of their marriage, Catherine lived a relatively conventional life as a plantation mistress, though she was isolated from other white society by the plantation's remoteness. But in 1842, when Adelaide was 4 years old, Marcus began to reveal his true intentions. According to Catherine's testimony, given years later in circumstances we'll discuss, Marcus told her that he had been conducting breeding experiments among the enslaved population, but that his results were incomplete. To truly test his theories, he needed to introduce what he called controlled variables. Specifically, he needed to breed enslaved men he had selected for their physical strength and intelligence with white women of proven fertility and superior breeding, namely, his wife. Catherine refused. Marcus beat her. She still refused. Marcus then showed her the reality of her situation. They were 40 miles from anyone who might help her. The nearest town was controlled by men who were Marcus's business associates. She had no money of her own. If she ran, where would she go? If she reported him, who would believe her over a wealthy white man? And most terrifyingly, he had their 4-year-old daughter Adelaide. If Catherine didn't comply, Marcus would begin the experiment with Adelaide instead, when she was old enough, around age 12 or 13. Catherine complied. According to her later testimony, Marcus selected an enslaved man named Samuel, who was 25 years old, considered the strongest worker on the plantation, and who had no choice in any of this. Marcus forced Catherine and Samuel into a locked room in the plantation house and told them both that they would remain there until Catherine conceived. If Samuel refused, Marcus would have him tortured and killed, and another enslaved man would take his place. If Catherine resisted, Adelaide would be next. What happened in that room was rape, of both Catherine and Samuel. Catherine was raped by the circumstances Marcus created, even if Samuel was technically the person in the room with her. Samuel was raped because he was enslaved and had no ability to consent to anything, and because refusing meant death. They were both victims of Marcus's control. Catherine became pregnant in late 1842. She gave birth to a son in 1843. The baby was visibly of mixed race, lighter than Samuel but darker than Catherine, with features that showed both parents. Marcus recorded this in his journals with clinical satisfaction. He named the child Experiment 1 in his notes, though Catherine called him Thomas and tried desperately to mother him despite the horrifying circumstances of his conception. Marcus continued the experiment over the next 5 years. Catherine was forced to conceive with 3 different enslaved men Marcus selected. She gave birth to 4 children total, all of mixed race. Marcus kept detailed records of each child's development: height, weight, intelligence, temperament, physical strength. He was creating comparison data. And then, in 1849, Marcus decided it was time to bring Adelaide into the program. Adelaide was 11 years old. Marcus had been grooming her since childhood, teaching her about breeding science, showing her his journals, taking her to observe the plantation's forced breeding among enslaved people, and framing all of it as normal, scientific, and morally acceptable. He taught her that enslaved people were naturally inferior, but that through careful breeding, they could be improved. He taught her that her mixed-race half-siblings were experiments to be studied, not brothers to be loved. He taught her that her body, like everything else on the plantation, was a tool in service of scientific progress. When Adelaide was 12 in 1850, Marcus told her it was time for her to participate in the experiment. According to testimony from enslaved witnesses who survived, Adelaide initially didn't understand what Marcus meant. She thought she would be observing and recording data, as she had been doing for years. When Marcus explained that she would be conceiving children with enslaved men he selected, just as her mother had, Adelaide screamed, fought, and tried to run. Marcus locked her in her room for 3 days with no food. He told her that this was what daughters did for their fathers, that this was science, that she had been prepared for this her entire life, that if she refused, her mother would be killed, and the enslaved people who had raised her, who she had some attachment to despite Marcus's teachings, would be tortured and sold. Adelaide was 12 years old. She had been psychologically manipulated her entire life. She was trapped on an isolated plantation with no access to outside help. Her mother had already been broken by years of this horror, and the man doing this to her was her father, the person who was supposed to protect her. Adelaide complied. Marcus selected an enslaved man named Joseph, who was 19 years old. Joseph later testified that he was taken to Adelaide's room, told what was expected, and informed that refusal meant death by torture. Joseph said that Adelaide was crying, that she apologized to him, that she said, "I don't want to do this over and over," but they both knew they had no choice. Adelaide became pregnant at age 13. She gave birth at age 14 in 1852 to a daughter. Marcus recorded this as Experiment 6 and expressed satisfaction that Adelaide had proven fertile at such a young age, which he noted in his journals as evidence of superior breeding potential. By August of 1854, when Dr. Morton arrived, the plantation housed a horror beyond imagination. Catherine had borne 4 mixed-race children through forced breeding. Adelaide, now 17, had given birth to 3 mixed-race children. There were 7 children total who existed as living evidence of Marcus's experimentation, ranging in age from 11 years old to 2 years old. The enslaved men, who had been forced to participate, lived with the trauma of being made instruments of rape against women who had no choice, and children who had no choice. Catherine had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Adelaide had been robbed of her entire childhood and adolescence, and Marcus continued to keep meticulous journals, planning the next phase of his experiment, breeding the oldest of the mixed-race children with each other once they reached puberty. Dr. Morton, to his credit, recognized that what he was seeing was not just abuse but a crime so profound that he couldn't ignore it, even though reporting it would challenge the entire social order of slavery. He couldn't report the abuse of enslaved people. That was legal. But he could report the forced breeding of a white woman and a white minor by their husband and father. That was criminal even in 1854 Louisiana. Dr. Morton traveled to Baton Rouge and filed a formal complaint with local authorities. He brought Marcus's journals as evidence. He testified about Catherine's condition and Adelaide's age. In September 1854, Marcus Blackwood was arrested and charged with unnatural practices, abuse of his wife, and endangering a minor. The trial that followed was held privately, with most records sealed to protect the reputation of white womanhood. Louisiana's elite didn't want the public knowing that a white plantation owner had forced his wife and daughter into breeding with enslaved men, not because they cared about Catherine and Adelaide, but because it challenged the fiction of white racial purity and white women's sanctity that justified the entire system of slavery and white supremacy. Marcus was convicted in November 1854, but not of rape or forced breeding. Those charges would have required acknowledging that enslaved men were victims, which the court would not do. Instead, he was convicted of unnatural practices and moral turpitude. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and loss of his property. Catherine and Adelaide were removed from the plantation and placed with Catherine's family in Virginia. The 7 mixed-race children they had borne were legally enslaved because their fathers were enslaved men, and Louisiana law stated that children followed the condition of their father in cases of mixed-race births on plantations. The children were sold at auction to pay Marcus's debts. The enslaved men who had been forced to participate received no acknowledgement, no compensation, no recognition as victims. They were sold along with the rest of Marcus's property. Marcus Blackwood died in prison in 1861 at age 59, shortly after the Civil War began. His journals were sealed by court order and lost for over a century. Catherine Blackwood lived until 1879. She never spoke publicly about what had happened, though she testified in the 1854 trial. She never saw the 7 children she had been forced to bear ever again. Adelaide Blackwood never married, never had children by choice, and lived as a recluse in Virginia until her death in 1897 at age 59. In her later years, she worked quietly with abolitionists and, after the Civil War, with organizations helping formerly enslaved people, though she never explained publicly why. The story only came to light in 1963 when a historian researching sealed court records in Louisiana discovered the Blackwood case file, including portions of Marcus's journals that had been kept as trial evidence. The historian, Dr. Ellen Shaw, spent 5 years verifying the story through court records, property documents, and testimony from descendants of enslaved people who had been on the plantation. She published her findings in 1969 in a book titled The Breeding Plantation: One Man's Eugenic Horror in Antebellum Louisiana. The story of Marcus Blackwood reveals the ultimate corruption of absolute power. Marcus had complete legal authority over his wife, his daughter, and the people he enslaved. The system of slavery, combined with patriarchal marriage laws and the isolation of plantation life, gave him the power to turn his family and his plantation into a eugenic laboratory where human beings became experimental subjects. Catherine and Adelaide were victims of Marcus's abuse and control. They were also white women who held racial privilege that the enslaved people on that plantation never had. Both things are true. The enslaved men who were forced to participate were victims of both slavery and Marcus's specific cruelty, forced to become instruments of rape against women and children who couldn't consent, living with that trauma forever. The 7 children produced by these forced breeding experiments were sold into slavery, despite having white mothers, because Louisiana law prioritized property rights and enslaved status over any acknowledgement of white maternity. They disappeared into the vast anonymity of the enslaved population, and we don't know what became of them. This is why we tell these stories. Not because they're easy to hear, not because they fit into simple narratives of good and evil, but because they reveal the absolute depths of horror that systems of total power can create. Slavery didn't just brutalize enslaved people, it gave enslavers the power to brutalize everyone, including their own families. It corrupted every relationship it touched. It turned fathers into monsters, wives into victims, daughters into experimental subjects, and enslaved men into instruments of violence against their will. Marcus Blackwood's breeding plantation was an extreme case, but it was made possible by a system that was not extreme. A system that legally defined enslaved people as property, that gave husbands complete authority over wives, that gave fathers complete control over daughters, and that allowed all of this to happen on isolated plantations where oversight was impossible and power was absolute. If this story disturbed you, it should. If it challenges what you thought you knew about slavery and power, good. That's what Buried Truths do. Subscribe to Buried Truths for more stories that expose the full scope of historical horror. Comment below, how do we understand victims who had no choice but were also used as instruments of harm? Share this with someone who needs to understand that systems of absolute power corrupt absolutely. The truth was buried in sealed court records for 109 years. We're making sure it's never buried again.